to the Data Science Deployed podcast. I'm Ben.
I'm Jillian.
I'm Donny.
Today we're going to interview Jillian to learn more about her work in bioinformatics. So let's just jump right in. Jillian, I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit about BioDeploy.
Yeah, of course. So, to hit on some background there, I really think that research scientists, people who are doing data science should be able to understand and deploy their own infrastructure. That's something I've always, been really passionate about and have moved things along in kind of various areas. I worked quite a bit on conda packaging for a while until I built all the packages I could possibly build, and then moved on from that. I've built a lot of Docker containers. I worked on a lot of workflow management systems and runners to help scientists actually be able to deploy their analyses to an HPC environment. So this is just kind of, I feel like, carrying on with that, with the work that I've been doing specifically on AWS and on the cloud. And I suppose the big point of BioHub is that it's going to enable scientists to deploy their own data science infrastructure on the cloud. That's going to include Jupyter Hub clusters, RStudio clusters, and also your traditional HPC along with the AWS flavor of HPC. So that's kind of the, the big picture of what it's doing. And then I'm hoping a little bit farther on down the line, I'm going to be able to start to really get into the very particular types of applications and some very particular problems in bioinformatics that people are creating, kind of what I call the new age of data visualization applications to be able to solve some of these issues. Because another push that I've seen in recent years is to have these very, very interactive applications that you can really go and in real time process, analyze, and kind of view and just make different models and all kinds of different things with your data. So I'm very interested in, I want to have a web interface, and I want a scientist to be able to click a button that says deploy my, single cell analysis application, and it spins up all the background for them. It spins up all the infrastructure for them in the background, gives it to them in a web browser, and they just don't even really have to worry about anything else.
And so are those custom one-off web applications, or is that built on something like Dask? How do you picture that working?
So it will depend a bit on the application. For some of these applications, there are, well-known solutions. So for example, with a type of analysis called single cell, which is analyzing cells as a bioinformatics problem, there are applications already available for that. One is called CellXGene, and that's one that I see to be quite popular. That's that's already built and managed. So for that would look something like taking the Docker application that is the CellXGene, creating a Helm chart, which is a type of configuration that you use to deploy these applications, and making it configurable in a way that the scientist can very easily plug and play, say, okay, I want to run CellXGene with this particular data set. I need this much memory, CPU. I can't remember if CellXGene does use Dask in the background, but quite a bit of these applications do use Dask or Apache in the background. So then that's another thing that we would also be able to, to customize for the user, is again have a web form that says, okay, so you need Dask with this, or Dask can make it run so much faster, and we will spin that up dynamically for you for this particular application, and have kind of a, like a house, like a CellXGene house, and everything is in there. So that will have your application, your data set, your Dask cluster if you need one, your Apache cluster if you need that, and these things will be, again, dynamically spun up and down.
That makes a lot of sense. One more follow-up before we move on. What is the AWS flavor of HPC?
It is called AWS Batch, and there's actually kind of a funny story with that. So AWS, when they were, I think this was some time ago, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, they were moving along and they were really, creating a bunch of cool solutions for everybody. And they released this AWS Batch, which was their own flavor of HPC. But the bioinformatics people were like, well, no, we just want, our standard HPC. What is this? And so they created a project called Star Cluster. I think it came out of MIT, but don't get mad at me, internet, if that's not the case. That was just the standard HPC cluster, which is usually using a scheduler called Slurm and uses just kind of, computers and storage and kind of, maybe an HPC environment that the software or the bioinformatics people were used to. And then at some point after that, AWS released another tool to deploy kind of your traditional HPC clusters called Parallel Cluster that is now kind of taken over the Star Cluster application. So bioinformatics people, you can have, the fancy AWS HPC, or you can have just the usual HPC with Slurm and networked file storage, and it's all fine. You can have both, or either.
Does the Slurm approach, I'm not familiar with the sort of Star Cluster, Parallel Cluster, but do they also run on Docker containers, or is that more straight on the host?
Nope, straight on the host. It's much more, like it runs off of EC2 instances, which are the AWS flavor of just spinning up a Linux server. So if you can, they did a good job with it. If you can manage a Linux server, you can probably manage an HPC cluster on AWS as well.
Jillian, you mentioned the importance with the scientists of interactivity, and I'm wondering how that plays, if there's any conflict between interactive versus deployed. A lot of people, when they think of something is being deployed, it's almost like it's going out into space. It kind of has to be, this object that's there. But it seems like a lot of scientists, your customers maybe, want some interactivity where they're kind of like building the tool a little bit and putting it out there. And I don't know. I also think of the conflict between a lot of people who just want to buy a microscope and put it up there. Or there are people who build the microscopes. And so it's like, what is that tension, especially with scientific research, I'm sure, with interactive development versus deploying? Like, how does that play out in terms of the infrastructure? Yeah.
That is actually, it's less of an infrastructure problem and more of a people problem. So traditionally there's been, quite a bit of tension and back and forth between kind of your typical IT departments and your research staff. So quite a lot of, like larger IT departments, if they're supporting a lot of research, they'll actually have a department within IT called advanced computing or research computing or HPC or something like that. And that department is just to deal with the researchers because the rest of IT won't do it. I worked in actually a department like that for a few years. It was very interesting. I learned a lot. But that's, I think, because historically, if you wanted to be able to do computing, you had to go and scope all of that out, buy a data center, hire admins, hire networking people, all that kind of thing. And you really had to plan everything, very, very far in advance, maybe 5 to 10 years in advance, because you don't want to buy a whole data center and then, if a year or a few months in realize like, this isn't enough, or it's too much, or, just have it not fit your needs. So now I think with the advent of more cloud computing, people are moving much more towards this kind of idea of on-demand computing. It should spin up when I need it to and only when I need it to. And I think this is just kind of a new paradigm that everybody's getting used to and moving more towards. In my experience, pretty much all the startups that I work with decided to go straight for AWS for cloud computing. And the reason that they did that was that they didn't want to have to go buy an entire data center and hire a bunch of support staff to manage that. They did not want to have to hire an IT department.
It's hard to blame them.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. You talked a little bit in your book about a virtual lab. I wonder if you could just expand on that concept for us a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So a virtual lab is this idea that you should have everything that you need for your data science project, and it should be kind of, I'll say containerized, but I don't quite mean containerized because I think that has such a specific connotation with Docker. But the idea is that you should have all of your documentation, you should have your data sets, it should be reproducible, it should have these applications that you might be using. So, for example, a lot of people are using things like Streamlit, MLflow, RShiny, or Dash to get these kind of very interactive data visualizations that you can really go and show, okay, this is exactly what's happening with the data, be able to plot out your data life cycle. all of these kind of issues that data scientists face when they are trying to, do reproducible research. And then in addition, part of the background is what's interesting from my point of view is, well, how do we get to this virtual lab? And to be able to get to a virtual lab, you need to have the infrastructure set up. And it's, ideally it should be a bit behind the scenes and transparent, and the data science shouldn't even particularly have to deal with it. So the data scientist should not be doing things like going and having to, I don't know what, request more storage from IT or something like that. That should just be built into the solution to begin with. And that's why I think, all of these cloud computing technologies are so interesting and so useful, because you can really, start from the ground up with building, this kind of very stepwise approach, which is you have your development infrastructure, which is probably an HPC cluster if you're running like very long running jobs, analyses that take, days or maybe even weeks. You want an HPC cluster, whether that's traditional or AWS, it doesn't really matter too much at that stage. And then in addition, you want this, this kind of new layer that I really see coming up more and more, where you have these auto-scaling, Jupyter Hub or R Shiny clusters, and people are really able to go into those, to interact with them. And it's, I think, a much different user experience than the traditional HPC was, where we used to do things like, if I would have an analysis and I knew it was going to take like a week, it would spit out a bunch of like PDF reports with, different plots and box plots and distributions and all these kind of things, because that was just, that was just the way that it was. The data sets were too big to be able to do any kind of interactive analysis on them. And I feel like that's, thankfully we're really moving away from that. That's really changing. So, so you have your, you have your long running analyses, you have your development clusters that are meant to be very automatically scalable. And because you have these new technologies, like you have Dask and Apache, you almost have like an HPC cluster that's a bit like built into your application, which is very, very informative of your data, especially if you're trying to deal with a very large amount of data, which I know is a very big issue in particular. Well, I suppose it is in all kind of areas, but in particular it is in bioinformatics. We're constantly outpacing, like the amount of data. Every time you buy a new microscope, chances are you are going to be generating like exponentially more data than you were with the previous one. If you do sequencing data, that's constantly getting, higher resolution and larger data sets. So the idea is then you have this kind of middle layer that really, I think of it as sitting in between the high performance compute clusters and the final, I suppose if you're in startup land, this would be like some kind of final intellectual property. And if you're in research, maybe it's a research project or a research paper. But eventually you want to have something really concrete come out of all this data and all of this analysis. And that really concrete thing that comes out of that is what I think of as being the virtual lab. And the clusters underneath the hood are really to support that outcome.
That's really interesting. So you talk about this sort of ideal state of the data science team can manage their own compute. They don't need to bug the IT team every time they need a little bit more storage or a little bit more compute. So if I'm running a brand new data science team, should I just open up an AWS account and start clicking around? Like, how do you go from blank slate to actual compute that you can use to do bioinformatics analysis?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think overall, different people are tackling this in different ways. And I like to think of it as sort of the DevOps people are maybe a bit behind the software people. So for example, in the software world, in the data science space, it used to be that you really kind of had to code everything by hand. And now we have all these nice libraries like NumPy. I do not have to code matrix algebra ever again, for which I'm very grateful. We have Dask, so I don't have to write MPI anymore. And that's great. So as time has gone by, the software folks have gotten some really, really good libraries and good systems in place for data scientists so that they can get, I would say, an awful lot of their work done without actually having to be software engineers. If they can understand a data frame and a matrix and maybe a little bit more than that, they're going to be able to move along pretty well with these tools. And I would say in DevOps land, we're not quite that far, I don't think, and that's a problem that I am personally trying to tackle, in particular with BioHub, with creating different recipes, different deployment scenarios that wrap up a bunch of the Lego pieces in AWS and deploy them into something that is actually functional. Because I found, that tends to be a pretty big problem with people when they're first starting out, is they're like, okay, I'm going to get an AWS account, and they sign up. And then there's a lot of things in the AWS console. I don't know if you guys have taken a look in there lately, but there is, like, I don't even know how many menus there are in there. And then you get different menus based on like different contexts and different regions. And if you're just starting out, it can be, very, very overwhelming to even just go in there and deploy, just like a simple server. Like I worked in IT, and the first time I logged into AWS to just deploy a server and be able to SSH and add NFS storage on there took me like a couple days. So instead I really want to move towards these, I think of them as, just pre-configured recipes that are going to allow data scientists to deploy these common scenarios that they need. So what do they need? They need HPC clusters, they need AWS batch clusters, and they need Kubernetes clusters. And in particular, a lot of the scientists that I work with, they don't really tend to care very much about the underlying infrastructure. Some of them don't even want to know about it. Some of them will just straight up tell me, they'll be like, listen, I used to be able to do this with Excel on a lab computer. And if I still could, I would be doing that, and I would never even talk to you. So what, so essentially they just don't want to know about any of it. They just want to do their science. That's what they're, what they're interested in. That's what their expertise is in. That's where they want to be focused. And I think that's fantastic, and that they should be able to do that. So in particular, one of the things that I'm really focusing on with BioHub is to actually have a very science-first approach, which is why I'm talking about, instead of telling people, oh, you need to deploy a Kubernetes cluster. I mean, most of my clients would be like, Kubernetes, what? Instead it's, no, you're going to deploy a Jupyter Hub cluster. You're going to deploy an RStudio server. It's going to scale for you automatically. Of course, words like this, they're going to understand. And then also to get into these different, these different applications. So for example, Cellix Gene, deploy their RShiny, RShiny dash Streamlit. There are too many of them for me to name right now. All these different applications that they are developing in-house, instead of, starting, I think, where a lot of the DevOps people expect for people to start, like all the way at the bottom end of that stack that I discussed earlier, from, HPC to dev to application. I want for people to be able to start where they're comfortable and, meet the scientists where they're at, which is, I need to deploy infrastructure to analyze single cell data or sequencing data or high content screening data. And we're going to start from that and then work our way down. So BioDeploy is going to deploy all the bioinformatics related things.
That makes a lot of sense. Just the level of abstraction that people want to deal with. If someone wants to, to do matrix multiplication, they shouldn't have to learn the IEEE 754 standard for floating point numbers. And we're sort of past that. They can, but they just don't have to. And so it's a similar thing. Yeah, AWS has all these wonderful primitives and means of combining them, but really people don't want to have to create their own abstractions. They kind of just, like you said, with Dask and NumPy, they kind of just want to say like, here's I don't really know what Kubernetes is, but I know Jupyter, and can I deploy Jupyter Hub cluster, because that's kind of the language that I use. So I love that what you said, the science first approach. Sort of a specialization of like domain specific, talking to what they're talking about. It's definitely interesting what you mentioned also with this middle layer between HPC and then the final research paper, and having this bigger back end. One question that I had prepared was, how do people go from research to production? But it sounds like almost in this case there's that, but there's also like, how do you kind of have this circle where you're kind of doing like your research is your production all the time? And I'm just wondering how people are sort of approaching that in science and research. It's maybe different than how people do it in other areas of deploying data science.
Yeah, I found overall people, by people I mean research scientists, are really trying to create more and more what I sort of call like standard operating procedures. So, if we have this type of data, we should have this type of standard analysis that is always run on this data. And, to be very, very careful with, I suppose, plotting that out, with planning the analysis, with, making sure that the data is really run its course. And in order to get to that point, you need to spend a lot of time, like even just researching the analysis itself. So before people can even get to those standardized pipelines, before that, they're developing the analysis. And what do they need to develop the analysis? Well, they need the HPC, or kind of like a Jupyter Hub cluster for that. Kind of just lost track of what I was going to say. But yeah. Oh, and then additionally, so along with with the SOPs, I am a really big fan of writing kind of living documentation, I suppose. So less like documentation, sort of what we think of in the software world, where it's like it's very, very technical, but instead more like exploratory documentation. And that's why I'm so interested in these technologies, like Jupyter Hub and RStudio, where you can create kind of these documents that really explain not kind of the end product, but instead the thought process that you used as you walk through the data. So, so for example, if you're doing a data analysis and you have some data and it's the first time, you've even gone through this type of data, maybe you're really early on in kind of developing the production analysis flow, you'll probably go through and plot distributions and try to find different ways to clean the data or to normalize the data, see where the outliers are, see where data falls off. And as you're doing all these things, you could be documenting everything, everything that you do in a Jupyter Hub notebook or in the RStudio document. I forget what they call that, like the R Markdown, that kind of thing. So instead of having, the end product documentation, instead have something that's much more exploratory and really shows like where your thought process was going. And I think if everybody kind of keeps on that all during the process, which I know is much easier said than done, but if everybody keeps on that, then hopefully by the end, at least the people who are working on the data should have a good understanding of everything that's gone into the data, and then also be able to make more informed decisions for their final production analysis if that's where they want to go.
Great. Another question I have is we've talked a lot about kind of an application-centric view of things and setting up all these different applications, but I'm wondering, what's your approach to how people can manage their data or get an overview of it? I know with like a real lab, sort of everything is at least in the lab, or like you have a physical lab notebook, and everything will be in there, and so you might not be able to find something in your lab, but it's going to be in this room somewhere, So how do you help people manage if they have this sort of ecosystem of applications, Jupyter Hub, but all these things, but they all have data that they might want to transport between applications, or just how do people manage their data? How do you help them with that, especially in this dynamic research environment?
That's been a really interesting problem to work on through the years. I guess I'm a little bit like old school about it. I want to be able to go into a terminal and run tree and have a pretty good idea of what is happening in the data. Maybe I have a max depth in there somewhere so that I don't see everything. But essentially what I usually like to do with that is set up the data analysis in such a way I will have a folder that says raw, like raw data. So this is the data directly from the sequencer. Nobody's allowed to touch this, or it's set in such a way that it's read-only. So we always have a copy of the raw data. And then, go into this idea of having the process data. And then generally in the process data have, directories within there that say the different steps. So say, for sequencing data, this would be something like QC, and then alignment, and then variant calling, and then some kind of filtration steps. So you go through these sort of various data analysis steps, and each one of those should be in its own directory. And ideally, each one of those steps should also come a bit with like its own report. So I think the QC one is kind of the easiest to do that because most QC tools, at least in the bioinformatics space, have their own reports that they output because that's, quality control, right? That's what you're doing with QC. Ideally, each one of the other steps would have that. So if you're analyzing something, again, sequencing data is usually genomics data. So if you've ever done something like, like 23andMe, or, if you're aware of the fact that you can analyze your own genome if you want to, or you can send it to a company who will analyze it for you. So let's take one of those companies that would analyze your genomics data for you. They should have kind of these processes where they're like, okay, so QC, we lost this much of the data due to these problems. And then the next step, alignment, we were able to align this much of the genome. And then the next step is variant calling. Okay, we called variants on this many positions in the genome, whereas, and if we compare that to kind of where other samples were or where the other genomic data is, you would think that would be kind of right, sort of in a equilibrium, I suppose, not too high, not too low, kind of a Goldilocks sort of zone. And, for every step along the way, you really need to have people who actually really understand the data and the analysis as well to go through and just say, hey, what makes sense at this stage? What should we be reporting on? What should, what should happen? What should the output be? What are kind of our flags to say, hey, something strange happened here, and all these kinds of processes. It's definitely, it's a long process though. And I mean, that's why you have in particular, research scientists that really, they will work on a single problem for decades to really get to this point.
I think that's interesting to hear you talk about sort of folder structure and the stages of the analysis and storing those all in separate places. What about versioning? Because I would imagine a lot of those stages are going to depend on some sort of code version, some git commit is the way I would think about it. Like eventually you're going to change that commit. Is there a good way to know like which of these stages now need to be updated based on this function I just changed?
You have to have really good documentation to know that. That's actually what got me really interested in building software for the Conda package manager, was that I felt like that was, much more built in, and you could have, so say for example, your analysis, and within your analysis folder, you could have a Conda environment variable, a Conda environment file that pins all the versions and things that you need. And so then, like, okay, or theoretically, for this stage in the analysis, this was the software stack that I ran it against. And that is actually very, very important to know. I know in particular, there was one group that I was working with, and they couldn't figure out why their analysis had stopped working. And it was because they had updated a software version, and it was like somewhere like deep in the stack too. It wasn't even the first thing that they were calling, but it was something, some software was calling some other software that was calling some other software, as we like to do in bioinformatics. And yeah, so it's a very intense problem. It's difficult to deal with because even when you have, so let's say I have a Conda environment. I think Conda does the best job so far of dealing with these different environments, but it's not even guaranteed that if you have a Conda environment file and I install it today, and then I go install it a year from now, that it's going to be exactly the same, or that, versions won't have been deprecated and replaced. So in the last few years, I've really moved towards Dockerizing all these software stacks for the analysis. I think that's the best way to do that. You can get, they're not like MD5 sum checks, but they're close with the Docker containers. So I think that's probably the best way of doing that, is that when you have this standard production analysis, build Docker containers, put that in some kind of build system. If you're using GitHub Actions, there's like a very nice build system for Docker to do that. Upload, make sure you're tagging the living daylights out of those Docker images. And then as you're doing your analysis, document, okay, this is the Docker image that we used, and this is the tag. And I think that's also where these kind of solutions that AWS comes up with are, really, really shine, because they have very robust logging, and it's pretty easy to turn on. For a lot of the AWS services, it's really like you just press a button, like enable CloudWatch logging, press the button, and you get, very, very, very comprehensive logs. So if you ever do need to go back and audit, you can do that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so one of the things you wrote in your intro chapter in your book that's available on your website, you said we care about good science more and more in the present day. Good science also relies on good data management and computational infrastructure. We've been talking a lot about that. I agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment. I'm curious for your assessment. How is the bioinformatics community doing on this front as a whole?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely moving along. I think in some ways, biology used to be a bit kind of behind the times in terms of computation. I don't know why this is exactly, but biologists. So, for example, if I went to college and I got a degree in biology, it is very possible I would get no computational training whatsoever beyond like maybe a little bit of Excel, and probably even that, like a really little bit of Excel. I wouldn't have to take any computer science courses or any programming courses. Whereas with I think almost every other major in the sciences that is expected, if you take physics, climatology, I was a neuroscience major, so I took at least a few programming classes. You know, we do expect for people to at least be a little bit familiar. I do think that's changing now with kind of the advent of bioinformatics. Like I don't think when I first got started in bioinformatics, there weren't even very many actual degrees or programs in it, and now there are quite a few. You know, if you wanted to go get a degree in bioinformatics, you could go do that now. So yeah, so I think it's getting a lot better. You're having a lot of people who are at least very interested in it. I would say it's kind of very important to the world at large. I would say, like if nothing else, COVID kind of I think showed us that bioinformatics is important, and we do need to have a lot more conversations between the scientists who know more about a particular family of genes than I know about my children, and the people who would be able to use that data to, kind of enact some good in the world. I think, I think overall, there's also a lot more educational resources as well. So when I first started to want to get into data science and machine learning, I actually just went to like Udemy and took, I don't know what, a $10 or $20 course, and that was enough to at least get me started. There's so much more that I think because of the amount of data that bioinformatics have to deal with, like if you're dealing with sequencing projects, it's kind of become this necessary evil that people are much more savvy than they used to be. But I think like in all the sciences, it's still a struggle. People still have a tough time with data management. They still have a tough time, versioning their analyses. We all also have to deal with the real world at times too. So for example, I think you asked earlier about versioning data. That can become extremely expensive, extremely quick if you are dealing with, these very large amounts of data. They might not have the budget for those. Maybe their departments aren't as understanding about why they should have the budget. So there can be these kind of conversations. Sometimes you have to get things out in a certain amount of time too, so you just have to deal with like time constraints, and you have people being like, this needs to be out last week. So there's also a lot of just real world considerations as well that we all need to deal with.
Following up on people having limited resources, a lot of the times, it's common in science to, you might have a principal investigator having their own lab, but you also might have an institution that has a shared lab or a shared resource where you can have, lots of equipment that, might not make sense for everyone to purchase individually, but they all sort of want time sharing on and that sort of thing. Have you encountered any of that in your work, or how are people kind of maybe collaborating on something where they kind of pool together their budgets or something to set up one AWS infrastructure? They can kind of have shared login, but also keep their pre-publication stuff separate, or how do people manage collaboration or approach that sort of thing, like in inter-team?
I'm sure it's one of those things that's a bit different everywhere, but what I found for the most part is that in particular with academic research, you will have like a center. So I used to work in the Center for Genomics and Systems Biology at NYU, and then it's almost a bit like a corporate structure in a way. So you have kind of this umbrella, and the umbrella has, the Center for Genomics, and then within that you have all these different labs, and each one of the labs is, supposed to go off and get at least some of their own funding to fund their experiments, and it's a bit of a catch-22 because they need to have money to do that, and because research is not always research is kind of by definition exploratory. You're not always going to get a result out of it. They do get some money in, but there's definitely a cap on that. So a lot of times, like larger research organizations, they will create what are called core groups. So I worked in a bioinformatics core, and the bioinformatics core acts as, essentially like a service department to all the labs. So I didn't just work for one particular lab. I worked for the Center for Genomics, and then I would go and help different researchers in different labs, as needed in different phases of their development. And I have seen that. Yeah, I've seen that quite a lot. There are sequencing cores, microscope cores, and they will support, it's one core team that supports many, many labs. And I think this startup, from what I've seen, the startups that are a bit farther along anyways, seem to have adopted a similar model. They will have, they'll have like their different departments, and then they'll also have, I think usually they just call it like a software engineering team or something like that. So they'll have, their software engineering department that deals with the software stuff for the scientists so that they don't always have to deal with that.
How do you see that collaboration working between the software engineers and the data scientists? Is it like how involved in the research and the scientific work are the software engineers? How much software engineering do the data scientists know? So how do you draw that line?
That is a fascinating line to draw because it is very much, it's a people problem. It's not a technical problem. So for example, I was saying earlier that I've worked in places where the IT department and the scientists, like they couldn't even speak the same language. So instead of, the IT department having to manage the science infrastructure, they would actually open up an entirely separate department for other people that could kind of speak the language. So then, so that gets to be very interesting because, again, you need to at least be able to speak both sides. Not necessarily you're an expert. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in any of the scientific topics that I've discussed, but I know enough that I can at least go and talk to the scientists, and I understand their problems, and I understand not even just their problems, but their priorities. That's something that I've really found a lot, is that, sometimes, and I found this a lot since I went out on my own as a consultant, it's not that the software engineers or the DevOps people can't solve those problems. It's that to them, those problems aren't a priority, or they're solving problems that kind of matter in the software world, but don't matter so much, I suppose, in like the real world. For example, one time I was working with a lab and they had all this data. It was like a machine learning, computer vision kind of problem. And they had, they had years worth of data, and they really didn't have a good way to be able to go through and sort this data because it was, I don't know, it was like hundreds of thousands of images or something like that. And the software engineer was like, well, obviously we need to optimize the algorithm, which is, very much the kind of take that you would expect from a software person, right? Like, oh, we need to, like we should just make the software better, and we should more elegantly abstract these classes and integer types, and this would just solve all of our problems. And, and then the poor scientists were over here like losing their minds because they're like, well, we have hundreds of thousands of images. Even if the algorithm's, really, really good, we still need another way to work around this. And so I wound up working with them for a bit, and I spent a lot of time just talking with the scientists, like really, because it was a new area of science for me, really just trying to understand exactly what was happening and exactly what their problems were. And I found that for this particular type of data, people had been studying this for decades. So there was lots and lots of published research on this particular type of data. And they knew that like 90% of the data that they were imaging was not going to be relevant to the actual subject that they were studying. I'm trying to be really general about it because it was, something that I signed kind of a scary NDA for. But like, so they had, I don't know, like hundreds of thousands of images, but 90% of them weren't going to be interesting for them. So initially they had somebody who was going through and looking at these images like one by one and very carefully looking at them. So one of the things that I did was I took a step back and I'm like, well, couldn't we get the algorithm to at least tell us whether or not this image is interesting or not? And that's a very, that is a much more solvable problem in the computer vision space, especially with these nicer new libraries that we have like TensorFlow and things. And it turned out that actually was something that could be solved. It was solved within like a couple weeks, I think, just to get something that says, yes, no, this is interesting or not. So we were able to get rid of, like 90% of the data or something, so that the scientists did not have to go through and do this really careful due diligence on hundreds of thousands of images. We got it down to like a couple thousand into the things that they were actually interested in doing their research and, and discussing further and doing further imaging to generate, even more data down the line. So I find a lot of times, in particular with my consulting, I'm called in on a lot of problems like that, where it's really, it's not the technical skills. People have the technical skills to solve these different problems, but it's, well, are we solving the right problem? Which I think is something, that's very, very important, that when different groups of people are working together, we should all kind of take a step back and say, like, well, wait a minute, is there another way that we could tackle this if we understood the problem better? Could we find a way to kind of turn this problem on its head? Because again, you do have to deal with real world constraints. If you have a very large amount of data and a small team of people to actually manually analyze that, you have to find some way to decrease the load on them so that they can ever actually get their work done.
That's awesome.
I really like that.
That was
a
a
lot.
very cool problem. That was very interesting. That was a fascinating problem to work on.
It seems like a great connection point between, the science and the software, the domain knowledge and algorithmic knowledge, because only the domain can like help you connect to like, well, what's actually garbage, instead of like let's process all the garbage faster. That's really great.
Yeah, I mean, I found that out by actually sitting down and like, I was trying to like sit there and like read the papers, and then like I would have to like go to the scientists and they would have to like explain these very, very simple things to me. And then, gradually, I mean, it was over like the course of weeks too, to even really have enough of an understanding. Then, then finally we were able to make the connection. And I was just like, wait a minute, you mean like 90% of this data you don't even need? And they were like, no, we just have to, we have to do the whole thing for due diligence, but most of it we won't end up actually using. And then that was the point that was able to get us further.
I have a question, appropriately enough, towards the end of our episode. What happens near the end of a project? A lot of these science projects, they'll have like a beginning, middle, and an end, and like the end might be a paper or something. And it seems like it might be a little different than maybe like a business case where you kind of have an ongoing thing that's tracking some process. So you kind of deploy it and you want to keep having it up. But it seems like a lot of times in research, you might deploy something to get a result, and then you might not need it anymore. And so, but maybe sometime in the future that needs to get redeployed or something. So how does that end of life of a deployment happen in your experience? And what are some gotchas or just things to keep in mind?
I found really recently, I've been working with a lot of startups that are doing drug discovery, particularly for personalized medicine. So an example of that would be, say I am in the unfortunate position that I have cancer. What would happen these days is I would go to the hospital, they would immediately sequence, like my genome and get every piece of biological information that they possibly could from me. They would send that to a company that would analyze that. And then based on my genome, I might react better to certain types of drugs, or chemotherapy or treatments. And that's what's known as personalized medicine. And there is a ton of research and a ton of money being poured into that. And it's another one of these topics that's really fascinating to me, because again, you do have these scientists who have poured, maybe decades into producing this very particular type of expertise around maybe a certain type of protein or a certain type of gene family. I mean, these are, if you want to talk about like niching down, like scientists, go talk to some biologists, they are the best at that. And what I found often is that I'm really starting to see a lot of these startups where these scientists, they do have this kind of domain expertise. And so they decide, okay, I'm going to go out and do some drug discovery. So they'll go through this whole process that we were discussing, the HPC, the development clusters. And then at the end of that, what they want to have is they want to have a piece of intellectual property that they can go sell to a pharmaceutical company. And then that's going to fund their, their next round of development. And what I found like more and more is that the kind of bar that you have to reach to be able to get to a piece of intellectual property from, let's say, from a pharmaceutical company has gotten significantly higher. It used to be, you know, that what we had were, again, the PDFs that we, you know, spit out from R at the end of the day that were like, well, this is, you know, pretty much what we think it's doing. And then, you know, maybe they would cite some literature or something like that. But I'm finding more and more now, the pharmaceutical companies really expect, you know, again, this very interactive data visualization. They want to be able to see everything that's happening. They want to be able to see it in real time, like very fine-tuned control the different parameters, just be able to examine the data, you know, every which way. Like if you've ever seen Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., it's a show, it's a sci-fi show, and they have the cool like hologram in the middle, and it's fun to watch because the actors are always going like, you know, like they're like moving it all around. That's what people want these days from, you know, from their intellectual property, and getting there, for the scientists to get there definitely tends to be a mission. And that's really kind of the direction that I see things going in. And I'm not just seeing that in, you know, in kind of startups and, you know, people kind of more transparently, I suppose it's more of a business engagement, but even in like research and academic research as well, a lot of the newer tools and things that are coming out are really geared towards this kind of new age, I suppose, of data visualization, where we want everything in real time, examine all the parameters, look at all the data from all the sides, and be able to do that now.
Okay. I think we're coming up on time. Jillian, before we leave, do you have any parting thoughts that you want people to know?
No, I am going to be building BioDeploy. I took most of this month off from client work so that I could work on it. And I kind of like this idea of, you know, just building it out in public. I'm a huge proponent of open source software. All the individual modules and recipes are going to be completely open source. Some of them are already on GitHub. I'll put it in the show notes, but it's Dabble of DevOps BioDeploy. Yeah, that's the name of the GitHub organization. All the recipes are going to be there. I'm hoping to at least have, you know, a lot of these recipes out. They're going to be, you know, anybody is going to be able to go and grab them, and hopefully, you know, at least, you know, theoretically make deploy, and then it will deploy in infrastructure for you, even if maybe you're not in a space where you could get the paid product. But, you know, but it's important to me to support the entire open source community, as well as, you know, support the fact that I have daughters and they like to shop. So anyway, so that will be all open source. You can go follow along with me. I don't know, I'm hoping to kind of blog about it, and then also to have the recipes up and about. This will also be the first time for me to deploy a SAAS on AWS, which I'm pretty excited about. I only recently learned that this was a thing. You can deploy a SAAS on AWS, and AWS will take care of your procurement, or like will take care of the payment processing, which means that I don't have to deal with people's procurement. And I am like, just as a lifestyle choice, that really speaks to me. So people will pay AWS, and then AWS will pay me. So yeah, again, I like the idea of just kind of building it out in public. And, you know, I think like all computer people, I'm just kind of figuring it out as I go along. So if you're interested in that kind of process too, go check out my blog. Hopefully there will be, you know, some more information on that soon.
Very cool. Well, thanks for talking us through bioinformatics and BioDeploy and all your work. I think that's it.
All right,
yeah, thank
cool.
you, Jillian.
Thank you, guys.